remember the first time I met Jesus. I was just Simon then, a fisherman. My brother Andrew had met Jesus earlier and told me that I had to meet him. Andrew was positive this Jesus was the Messiah. Well, I jumped at the chance to see him. There was nothing, but there was nothing impressive about him. At least at first glance, he was just another Jew. But as I met him and he spoke to me, it was like he already knew me. I didn't know how to react, so I went back to work. I jumped back in my boat and went fishing. Oh, sorry. I just jumped into the story without really telling you who I am. That's not unusual for me. I tend to jump first, and then half the time I have to jump back because I jumped the wrong direction. So, where should I begin? Who I am. I'm a fisherman. The sea's my life, and every day except on the Sabbath, my brother Andrew and I would head out onto the Sea of Galilee to support our families. We were one of many boats that would go out each day or even all night, often with our friends James and John. And as Jews and fishermen, life had a rhythm to it, a purpose, even under the rule of Rome and that crook, King Herod. Saying prayers, studying the Torah and other holy books, and then just that daily rhythm of casting nets, hauling in the fish, repairing the lines, and just going back out again. It was all I knew. I thought it would always be that way, and to be honest, I thought it would always be enough. But one day, a while after I had met Jesus that other day, he comes walking down the shore. He's walking straight toward me, like he's on a mission. And that was the day that everything changed. I was just sitting there. I was mending my nets. I was exhausted from a long night of fishing without catching anything. And I had planned to just sit there and fix my nets and head home to get some sleep. I was tired and hot and frustrated. And Jesus walks up, and there are these other people following him, and he's trying to teach them. And Jesus walks straight at me, and then he walks right by me, and he gets into my boat, and he starts teaching the crowd from this new position. And I just sat there, looking like a fish out of water, and I began to listen to his teaching while I continued to mend my nets. And then after a little bit, Jesus, he turns to me and he says, "Put out into deep water and let your nets down for a catch." I wanted to laugh. Truly, who is this guy? I heard he was a carpenter by trade. What did he know about fishing? I just wanted to jump up and head home. I'd been out all night and the sea had given me absolutely nothing that night. Still, there was something about him and what he was teaching that made me want to agree to his request. I told him, "Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." And so we did. And then it happened. The catch was huge. The nets I had just repaired, they were beginning to break, and we called for help, and even then the boats almost nearly sank from the weight of it all. All those fish, I was overwhelmed, but not just by the fish, but by Jesus. I was so wrong to doubt him. I fell to my knees and I looked up and I said, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." But Jesus didn't leave. He looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see everything. And he saw my fears and my impulsiveness and my failures and into the depths of my heart. And then Jesus looked at me and at Andrew and said, "Don't be afraid. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Well, that was the beginning. I jumped up and I left everything, my boat, my nets, my life, everything, and I followed him. I didn't understand it then, and sometimes I still don't. But there was something about him, something that made leaving everything else behind no sacrifice at all. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Jesus called me Peter, the rock. Imagine that, me, a rock. I've never been particularly steady. I'm more like an avalanche or a hailstorm. I'm quick to speak. I'm very slow to listen and often ruled by my temper. But Jesus saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And he began to shape me bit by bit. And I remember the day he gave me that name. We are in Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus asked all of us, "Who do you say that I am?" And everyone else was quiet. But I couldn't hold it in as usual. And the words just jumped out of me. "Well, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus looked at me with the same knowing gaze and said, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." A rock? A foundation? It felt like such an honor, such a responsibility, but I would learn painfully how far I was from being the steady foundation that Jesus was seeing in me. Instead of being a rock-solid foundation, I was more like a rock sinking down to the bottom. What do I mean? Well, one night Jesus had sent us out across the Sea of Galilee in a boat. He said he was going to meet us on the other side after he was done praying. We were not sure how he was going to get there, but Jesus said go, so off we went. And as we were crossing the sea that night, a huge storm kicked up. The wind was blowing hard, and there were large waves that were crashing against the boat, and some of the disciples were looking out, trying to look for help, and someone saw someone walking on the sea towards us. And at first, we thought it was a ghost, but then Jesus spoke to us. "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And I was amazed. And I cried out, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you." And Jesus simply said, "Come." So I jumped out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards him, and my eyes, they were fixed on Jesus. But then my focus changed to the howling wind and the crashing waves, and fear just gripped me, and I started to sink, and I cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and he caught me. "Oh, you of little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" Well, it's a question I've asked myself many times. Why do I doubt? Why do I jump forward in faith and then I jump back in fear? I've seen his power, I've felt his love, and still I stumble and I fall. The darkest moment of my many failures came on the night he was arrested. During our last Passover meal together, Jesus told us that all of us would fall away. Of course, I jumped up and I swore to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus looked at me with such sadness in his eyes, and he said to me, "Truly I tell you that this very night, before the rooster crows 3 times, you will disown me." I declared it to him with all my heart. "No, if I must die with you, I will not deny you." I couldn't believe it. Me? Deny him? Never. I was supposed to be the rock. I was supposed to stand firm no matter what happened. Well, later that night, we left the upper room where we shared that Passover meal together, and we headed to a garden called the Gethsemane where Jesus wanted to pray. And while we were there, Judas, one of our own, came with temple guards carrying clubs and swords, and they tried to arrest Jesus. But before they could do that, I jumped in between them and Jesus, and I swung my sword around to protect him. And in the process, I wounded a man by cutting off his ear. And instead of being cheered on, Jesus scolded me. And he healed the man's ear. And then Jesus surrendered himself to the guards. And they hauled him off to face the Sanhedrin. At that point, we all fled in fear. Instead of standing up, we deserted him. And as I remembered my brave words from just a few hours earlier, I followed from a distance. And as I arrived at the courtyard of the high priest, I could hear them questioning Jesus and making false accusations against him. But then others in the courtyard saw me and they started to question me. "Well, you were with Jesus of Galilee," someone said. And I replied, I don't know what you mean." Another pointed at me and said, "This man is one of his followers," and I denied that as well. And then another person said, "Well, certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." And I shouted at them and swore, "I don't know that man." And immediately after I said those words, I heard the rooster crow. I can still hear that rooster, that piercing sound, and I can still see Jesus because he turned to look at me from across the courtyard, and his face, beaten and bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were full of sorrow, not for himself, but for me. And I ran out of there and I wept bitterly. So I had failed Jesus. I'd betrayed him, denied even knowing him. And throughout that night, the priests, Pilate, and even King Herod continued to question Jesus. And he was beaten, and he was mocked and put on trial. And then he was sentenced to die as the crowds of the people cried out, "Crucify him." And soldiers marched Jesus to Golgotha, and they executed him on a cross. The remainder of that day, as well as the next day during the Sabbath, and the following day, we all hid like cowards in a locked room. You see, we were afraid of being arrested and being crucified like Jesus, so much for dying with him. And then suddenly, Mary came banging on the door, and she let me in, she cried. "Jesus is alive and the tomb is empty." Immediately I jumped up and John followed me, and we ran to the tomb where Jesus' body had been placed. And John, he ran past me, but he stopped at the entrance of the tomb, and I jumped past him into the tomb, and it was empty, except for the burial cloths. I mean, could it be? Could it be that Jesus was alive? Well, we went back to the room where the others were hiding, told them what we saw, and we're trying to make sense of it all. And then in that locked room, Jesus appeared to us. He said, "Peace be with you." It was really him. He showed us his hands and the wound in his side, and he said to us, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." So receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. And with you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld. Well, after his resurrection, Jesus appeared to us many times. Yet in my heart, I felt unworthy to be in his presence. I didn't know what to do. And one day I jumped up and I just told the other guys I'm going to go fishing. And about half the disciples came with me. It was kind of like old times. So much, in fact, we fished all night and caught nothing. And then a man on the shore called out to us to cast our nets on the right side of the boat. Whatever, I thought. But we gave it a try. And the catch was so large, it nearly tore our nets. John looked at me and he said, "It's the Lord." And I threw off my cloak and I jumped in the water and I swam to shore. And there Jesus stood, waiting for us with a fire and bread and fish. And after we all ate together, Jesus asked me, he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," I said. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," he said. He asked again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And again I answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Tend my sheep," he said. A third time he asked me, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" I was devastated that he asked me again. But I answered, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," he said. "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." 3 questions, 3 affirmations, and 3 commissions. Jesus was restoring me, redeeming me from my 3 denials. And in that moment, I realized something profound. You see, his love was greater than my failure. His grace was deeper than my sin. In that moment, Jesus also let me know that a day would come when I would also see death come to me on a cross. But I would face it with faith instead of fear. Well, lots of events have come after that day, but none would have happened without that initial invitation, "Follow me." I truly had no idea where I was going. I just jumped. From then on, I tried to live up to the name that Jesus gave me. And I've stumbled, of course, because I'm still me. And I keep jumping. But Jesus never lets go of me. You see, he's my good shepherd. And I am just one of his sheep. And yet, with all my mistakes, he has called upon me to follow him and shepherd others. I've seen his church grow, seen lives transformed by his message. I've preached and taught and healed and baptized in his name. Not because I am worthy, for I am not, but because he is. And I know, looking back, I think on all he's done. I remember the sea and the storms and the miracles and the cross, and I remember the empty tomb and the fire by the shore. And I remember his words, "Follow me." Jesus called me Peter, the rock. But I've learned that the true rock is Jesus, because he is the cornerstone. He's the foundation, and upon Jesus Christ alone we build. My hope, my life, everything is in him. So I leave you with this. Love him, follow him, trust him, even when you falter, for Jesus is faithful, even when we are not. And I know by faith his grace is sufficient for me in all things, even as I later face my own death upon a cross. While I was impulsive, Jesus was eternally intentional in his mission. From his birth, through his life, through the miracles he performed, to those he called to follow him, and to those he came to save, and to those he challenged. Jesus called us to follow him to Jerusalem, where he went to the cross and he died to free all of us from the bondage of sin and death, so that we can all jump for joy, for the tomb is empty. And now, even in death, I jump for joy into the arms of Jesus, for he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Amen.